This week I want to mostly just introduce the class and go over some broad things. We'll dig into more in the subsequent weeks, I promise. There's lots of time for that. I want to highlight what I said before, but just one more time in case any weren't here. There are 2 weeks that I won't be here. It's in the syllabus, so don't come on those days. I just realized I don't think I've updated that in the calendar, so I will do that. Just pay attention. They're kind of, one of them is next week. So next week, instead of coming here, go to Resurrection Greek Church in Castro Valley and celebrate their parish feast day with them and have some lamb afterwards. It'll be delicious, I'm sure. The next one's a few weeks off, so you've got some time. The next is just a very brief overview of the style of this class. I'm sure many of you have questions, things you've run into here, because everyone here at least has been here a few times, online, etc. I want to make sure that you have plenty of opportunity to have all manner of questions asked. So I try to talk half or slightly less of the time and leave the rest open to you all to ask questions. Don't feel bad asking questions about anything. The things we talked about, of course, but anything else you may have read online in a book, heard here in a homily, whatever it may be, feel free to ask. The point of this is for you all to ask questions and learn stuff. So, like I said, I'll try and keep it brief. There's one or two of those days that I know, because I've done this a few times, I go a little long, but I'll try to keep it there. I try and keep this to about an hour. In the past, there's been a few times where we've pushed it a bit, but try and keep it about an hour. So, of course, if you really want, you can stick around for a little bit. That's on you guys. And then every week I'll give you a new handout. Usually it's two-sided, but for this first week it's just the one side. With basics of what we talked about. Obviously that won't reflect all of the discussion we have afterwards. But it at least gives you something a little bit, especially if you have to miss something. And like I said before, these are recorded. They should stay on YouTube forever. So if you did miss one, feel free to ask me, and I can send you the handout for the week, and then you can follow along in the video if you want when you have a chance. Anything else you've all found where this is and when this is, so that's not going to change. Good job there. Yeah, I think that's pretty much everything. My contact information is in the syllabus, so if you've got questions, feel free to contact me any of those ways. I'm not shy when it comes to people contacting me. I get lots of emails and texts and whatnot, so whatever's best for you, feel free to reach out to me, and I will try and get back to you as quickly as I can, within a few days usually. Sometimes it gets a little longer, but I try and be prompt. So that's another option if you'd rather ask something that you don't want to talk in front of this crowd of people. Feel free to reach out to me privately. And the last thing I want to say is if any of you would like to meet individually one-on-one, you have my contact information now, so set that up whenever you want. All right. Let's talk a little bit about some of this stuff, and then I'll open the floor up to whatever you guys want to talk about. So a lot of this is stuff that I promise we'll get into more in subsequent weeks as well, so don't, if we start trying to dig into something later that is from here, but a topic we'll cover later, I will deflect it a little bit, at least for that. But so the Orthodox Church didn't come from nowhere. We weren't just popping up out of some town or something. You follow the Gospels, you follow the New Testament, right? And the apostles go out and they found a church, right? All the places they go, you read in Acts and read in the other lives of the apostles. They go, they ordain people, they establish churches all over the place. That church didn't go anywhere. This is the direct continuation of that church. Obviously, none of them came to here, specifically in Fremont, California, but they went far and wide, and after their deaths, it just continued to spread. So we are the direct continuation of that. However, it started in Jerusalem. It started with Jews. Hopefully that's not a surprise to anyone. And so a lot of what we do follows Jewish practice in one way or another. That may or may not be immediately obvious today when you look at modern Jewish practice, because our practice follows Jewish temple practice. practice, right? We have a temple with an altar where we offer sacrifice to God, which the Jews don't do anymore because their temple is destroyed. So a lot of the rituals that surround that have fallen long out of use, but that is where a lot of these things come from. When I say Jewish practice, that's what I mean. If you have ever been to a Jewish service of any kind, you'll know that it doesn't really look anything like this. In fact, from my own experience, it looks more like a Protestant service today, but I understand that probably varies a little bit depending on where you go. Anyway, all that to say, how many of you seen Fiddler on the Roof? None of you?
No, of it.
Okay. There's a scene in there, it's about Jews in Russia. They show a synagogue, and it's covered, floor to ceiling, in what we would call iconography. It's not quite exactly like this, obviously, but images from the Old Testament. So we didn't make any of this up, I promise. This is Jewish practice that we have continued until today. Obviously, at the very, very beginning, Christians were Jews. They worshipped in the Jewish temple, and then they left and did the meal afterwards. The ritual meal that Christ prescribed in the mystical or Last Supper, whose icon is in the middle there. This service after the service, so to speak, wasn't just hanging out. If you read in the epistles of Paul, he describes liturgizing and laying hands on people. That word liturgizing doesn't just mean singing hymns, but it means following specific rubrical practices, following the cycles of the year, etc. And that's Paul, right? I mean, that's about as early as you can get. Obviously, we've continued that. Our liturgy is Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, at least the one we use most frequently. That's an abbreviation of the Liturgy of St. Basil, which is an abbreviation of the Liturgy of St. James, which hopefully is a name you recognize, right? Very, very early, right? These are early practices that have been continued to today. St. Justin, martyr, another very early Christian writer. Next week, I think. Or maybe it was supposed to be this week. Maybe this was supposed to be a double-sided handout and I messed up. Sorry, I'll give it to you next week. I have a calendar that shows the church. And Justin Martyr, I think, is writing the 200, something like that. 3rd century. Very early. And he gives a description of a liturgy. Now, it's a very simplistic description, right? He's not going into a lot of detail. But what he describes pretty much matches what we do today. Obviously, like I said here, he was writing for a pagan Roman audience. So there's a lot of... It's very high level. But it's pretty clearly the same thing we're doing today in one form. Obviously, after that, the church saw a great deal of persecution from the hand of the Roman authorities and abroad in the other pagan lands the church was brought to. It wasn't just a Roman thing. However, the church continued to grow rapidly. A lot of the time, and if you've heard any of my homilies, I mentioned this a good deal, the thing that drove people to convert en masse was seeing the witness of people living the Christian life. That meant the way that they lived in service to others, especially. There's a few points you can kind of look at the growth charts where you see these big spikes that largely tie to points of plague in the empire. And the reason that you see a big spike in conversions is because people saw the Christians were the ones taking care of the sick people that no one wanted to do anything with, that were being left abandoned in the streets, etc. And they were compelled by the love and compassion that was shown. Additionally, at the end of life, especially during intense persecution, oftentimes you hear about saints that are martyred and those with them, and oftentimes that is the people from the crowd that saw this and were moved in that moment and said, I'm a Christian too, even though they'd never stepped foot in a church before, and were martyred in that moment with whoever it was that they were joining. So it's the witness that is really what converts people. Obviously, I mentioned a little bit about the Bible, the Scripture. This didn't just fall into our lap, as he sometimes is implied in other groups. But for us, anyway, the church predates the Bible, right? The first Christians, after Jesus does his thing and ascends into heaven, they do stuff, right? And it isn't until quite a bit later that we get everything written down. In John's case, a good number of years, right? Like 50-ish plus years later until we get his gospel account. So the church predates the Bible. Not by a long shot, but by a good bit. So it isn't the Bible itself that is the important, all-important thing, right? It is Christ. It's Jesus. And the Gospels are the witness of his life, his death and resurrection, his work for us. And because of that, they are very central to, in fact, the central of our tradition outside of Christ himself. But they are ultimately in service to the church, not the other way around. You'll often hear scripture in tradition as the sort of tagline there. This is made even more apparent by the fact that if you look at different early Christian writers, bishops especially, they will have lists of good books for people to read, basically defining the New Testament, and they're different. They'll include different books. Some of them will include letters from Barnabas, Polycarp, etc. They'll include other early Christian, but not necessarily disciples or apostles. They'll include some others like the Didache or another one I'm blanking on right now, but Shepherd of Hamas, I have it here. And others don't. And it isn't until quite a bit later that we start to see these lists start to unify, shall we say, amongst the different people defining them, until eventually we have a council that confirms multiple people's previous lists as correct, except those lists vary. So officially, we don't really have a truly closed canon of Scripture because those that were defined at a council conflict with each other. Which isn't to say that we add new books, because we don't, but just an interesting note that it took quite a while for the church to even decide which books would go in the Bible, would go in the New Testament. And even when it did ultimately decide, it still couldn't quite agree on which exact ones should be in. If you look at some of the older branches, again, next week I'll show you the calendar or the timeline that shows some splits. There are a handful of smaller churches that split off that still in some form or fashion exist today. One of those is the Orthodox Church in not Estonia. Very wrong continent. Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church has, I want to say, 1 or 2 additional books from ours. If you look at our list, it's longer than what the Catholics have, and the rest of the Christian world. I do want to point out that certain texts, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter, have never been included in any of these lists. That you sometimes hear people talk about as being interesting books to read. They've never been disputed. They have always been soundly rejected as being false. Many of them being Gnostic in some form or other, but regardless, not accepted by the church ever. Not once do they appear in anyone's lists. The Old Testament has never been disputed. We use the Septuagint, which is a means of the 70, and it was a translation that was done by the Jews a good bit before Christ was doing his thing, and it was the most common form of the Old Testament used at the time of Christ and his ministry. Most Jews did not speak Hebrew, they spoke Greek, and so they used the Greek Old Testament. And it wouldn't be until quite a bit later that they would start to reject the Greek Old Testament as being Christian and would try to redefine their Hebrew text to be what it is today. All right. The first 1,000 years or so of the church were more or less in unity. There is, like I said, there's a few minor splits that happen, and there's tension building for quite some time, hundreds of years, between the Roman See and the rest of the church. This sort of constant pushing the line, trying to take more power than is want to be given. There's several instances where the Pope, the Patriarch of Rome, tries to do something and the rest of the bishops say no, that you don't have the authority to do that. For example, he tries at one point in time to anathematize all of the Asian churches, and the response from everyone else is, no, you can't do that. Those aren't your churches, you don't have jurisdiction, you can't do that. There's a few other instances of similar ilk. Conversely, there are a few times where he legitimately has some very good critiques of Eastern bishops, but that's a different thing. A lot of times people would date the split at 1054. That's not really fair, because they didn't know in 1054 that it was final. It was much more like, if any of you today are familiar with the split between Moscow and Constantinople, that was how it was treated at first. They knew that they were at odds with each other, they didn't really like the things each other were doing, but they didn't assume that this was a forever thing. And so you see there are several attempts at reunion, and it isn't until quite a bit later that they finally come to terms with the fact that, no, we're not getting back together again, we're done. We've gone our separate ways, and there isn't any healing this at this point in time. Rome obviously has its own issues that lead to the Reformation, and a whole bunch of splits that happen because of that. We've never had a Reformation, so we don't have anything like that. There were some attempts at reconciliation, both from the Catholic Church and actually from some branches off of that. Some of the early reformers tried to reach out back to Orthodoxy. All of these were met with various forms of, well, okay, but you're teaching weird things, so stop doing that and then you'll be fine, in one form or another. Later, the Turks take over Constantinople, and liturgical vibrancy quickly dies off. That is to say, at one point in time, I just said earlier that we've got primarily the liturgy of St. John. We also use the liturgy of St. Basil during Lent, which we just finished. And occasionally in Lent, we use the liturgy of St. Gregory. Very occasionally, some people still use the liturgy of St. James, but not very commonly. We'll talk about those later, so don't feel bad if you don't remember them. There were other liturgies that were done originally. After the Turkish occupation and whatnot, a lot of that kind of died out, and it became more focused on just the one liturgy. A lot of things like deaconesses died out around that time. Deacons also became a lot more rare. They used to be a requirement for churches, and at that point in time they became wildly optional, and in many cases utterly unheard of, and so forth through the other ranks of clergy as well. Of course, the church does survive. It's not stamped out, and the churches that are there today have been there forever. 1794, Russia sends the first people over to here, the New World, starting in Alaska, but it makes its way down to actually here-ish, San Francisco, Bay Area, and then from there it goes across the country to the East Coast, and north and south through Canada and Mexico and down into Central America. Less of a solid foothold in Mexico, and the farther south you go, pretty reasonable Canada though. Initially, there was no distinction like you have today between Antiochian and Greek and Rokor and OCA and Romanian and Serbian and whatever else. You needed a church, so you didn't really care who you were next to, you just all went to the one church because that was the only one anywhere near you. With time, especially with the waves of immigrants from one group or another, you start to get a lot of Greeks in an area, or a lot of Serbs, or a lot of Russians, or a lot of whatever. And they do have their own minor variations to their traditions, the way they do things. And so they start to form little communities, and eventually those grow into the churches we have today, where we have a wide variety. I will point out, though, that there is nothing actually different between any of these. Greek Orthodox, Antiochian, Rokor, OCA, or by extension any of them that say Russian Orthodox, Serbian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Georgian. I'm trying to think if there's any other here. Jerusalem. That's all I got off the top of my head anyway. All the same. There may be some minor differences in the way the vestments are cut, the way the choir sings, the style of iconography, which feast days are important, that kind of thing. But the text of the services are identical. What the choir is saying is the same. Although in English the translation might be mildly different if they're doing it in English, but it's generally speaking the same text. And the vestments are in iconography, I mean, they're all obviously related. They're just a little bit different. And we can freely go to any of them. So if you are ever traveling or something, and there isn't an OCA church in town, but there is an Antiochian one, go to the Antiochian church, or Rogor, or Greek, or Serbian, Romanian, etc. The Bolshevik Revolution was one that really started to become a problem because we stopped having hierarchs funded from Russia. And so all these little ethnic communities that were starting to spring up suddenly had no bishop or didn't know if they would have a bishop, and so reached out to back home to have clergy sent. And that's why we have separate hierarchies now for Greeks, Antiochians, Serbians, Romanians, whatever. Again, that was not the case originally. So many of our North American saints were part of that original church, if you will, before there started being a difference in Greek and Serbian, Romanian, whatever. Unfortunately, that lasted for a little while, but not long enough. And so that takes us to today, where, as I've mentioned, this is OCA, Orthodox Church in America. We are what is called autocephalous. It's a fancy word that means we get to do our own thing, we don't report to anyone. We elect our highest leader ourselves, and he, along with the synod of other bishops here in North America, have the final say over matters in this country. That is not the case for any of the others that I've mentioned. They all have hierarchs abroad who make the final say for many of their big decisions. We don't have that. We don't report to anyone. So Metropolitan Tikhon of North America is our highest guy. He sits as sort of like a Speaker of the House on our synod, meaning he can call all the bishops together to request that they talk about something. He'll mediate between bishops if there's a problem, interpersonal or whatever. But when it comes down to matters of jurisdiction, he does not have authority outside of his own actual diocese, which is on the East Coast. And he cannot do anything other than vote once like everyone else in the votes of the synod. This style of leadership is the same that the church has always had. That is what the Pope was back in the day for the broad church as a whole, the Speaker of the House, able to call these meetings, councils to order, mediate between people if they needed it. If it came down to a tie, he could break that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, he had one vote and no authority outside of his own jurisdiction, which, as I pointed to before, he did try and press sometimes, but it rarely went well for him. So, there we go. That is the Orthodox Church. I've got some definitions. I don't always have these, but there's some stuff you can read. I'm not going to read them to you. And then some further reading. The Didache is available online. Just search for it. You'll find it. It's not that long. And then St. Justin Martyr's First Apology is a very good, that chapter 65 is where he gives that description if you're curious. So, again, the further reading I don't always give, but if it's pertinent to whatever we talked about, I will. And the syllabus has a bunch of different books and stuff you can check out. So that's all I have. I will turn it over to you all. Just double check what we did for time here. All right, there you go. About half an hour. Questions you may have? Sure.
So in the very beginning, you were saying we adhere to a lot of Jewish texts. Why do we not adhere to the Talmud, but we adhere to the other Jewish?
The Apostolic Council defined how we interact with the Jewish faith. If you remember in the Acts of the Apostles, it describes all of the apostles getting together. There was an argument between which two? Do you remember?
The Helpless Jews, and there's another one, right?
Yeah, but who are the leaders of those factions, so to speak? factions is a strong word, but one of them was Peter. Who was the other?
Paul.
Paul, yeah. And one of them was what? You just said it.
Oh, the Hellenist Jews?
Yeah, but in what way? Meaning?
Like Greek-speaking Jews?
Yeah, and not necessarily even Jews. Those people. Kind of the everyone else.
Oh, the Gentiles, right?
Yeah, Gentiles, but also just the Jews from out there, who didn't necessarily speak Hebrew, didn't go to the temple all the time. And who was the other camp? Hopefully that's kind of obvious. No, maybe not. The Jews that were in the Jerusalem area around the temple that had their very strict ties to temple practice. And so the discussion was, those that are coming into Christianity, what do? Are they Jews? Do they need to be circumcised? Do they need to follow all the laws? Or not? And what did they decide?
That the Gentile or the nations were exempt from certain practices.
Yes. Some of that they defined pretty clearly. Things like the refraining from eating blood was maintained. Other things like circumcision were allowed to pass away, or maybe more so to be transformed into baptism, which is often called circumcision of the heart. So that is how we came about to being Jews but not doing all of the Jewish stuff. So if you want to read more, we'll read the Acts of the Apostles.
How does the church then also treat the other, like these, like the didact or the dedicated shepherd or ramaz? Like, so they're not canon, but how does it treat them though?
Well, those specific ones are basically Christian. Well, they're different. The Didache is catechetical, which is part of why I recommend reading it, meaning instructions. It describes how to be a good Christian in terms of what to do and what not to do. The Shepherd of Hamas is a story, Christian-inspired story. We consider them to be good reading. Same with the other epistles of Barnabas and that kind of those early writers. We would read them just like we would the readings of St. John or St. Basil or whoever else, St. Gregory. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. Any of these early Christian writers, whether it be super early or a little bit later, they've all got good stuff to say. They've all got helpful things to be said. So by all means, read them. We just don't treat them quite the same level as the things that are specifically about Jesus' life and ministry.
When you said the liturgy today is an abbreviation of
Mhm.
4 and 4, what exactly, like shorter? Or,
Mhm.
so the original one was like longer?
Yeah, like 4 hours-ish. Liturgy of St. James is quite long. It is still done occasionally. In a few places, they'll do it on his feast day. I've never seen it. I don't know how to do it. I was not taught. Liturgy of St. Basil is, depending on how fast you read, anywhere from maybe half an hour to an hour if you really take your time longer. And then St. John's is the one we do all the time, so you're fairly familiar with that. It was quite literally abbreviated because people couldn't stand to be in church for that long. When St. John writes about the reason why he's abbreviating, it's just because he wants more people to go to church. He'd rather you be in church for a complete but shorter service than not. So, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know that we've necessarily strayed very far from that. But we have not continued to shorten it. At least not in the OCA. There are actually some groups that have done some minor abbreviations for the liturgy itself. For the other services, that's a wildly different story. But for the liturgies themselves, they're mostly the same wherever you go. There are a few different things. The very beginning of liturgy can vary a little bit between different jurisdictions, but generally speaking, it's pretty much the same thing.
For the apostolic tradition, what are like other traditions that are passed down that are not so they're not written in scripture, but like I think like St. Basil talks about that there's certain traditions that are passed down from the apostles but aren't written down. So like what are like some examples of those?
Almost all of the feasts of Mary. or nowhere in Scripture. So like her, we begin and end the liturgical year with her nativity and her repose. Those aren't described anywhere in any of the Bible books of any kind. But we have very clear and very firm opinions on what happened because of our tradition. Off the top of my head, I mean, that's what comes to me initially. I'm sure there are liturgical things as well. There's a wide variety of things that aren't really written. They're just taught to us when we go to seminary. The books will say things like the deacon goes to his usual place. Hope you know where that is.
Yeah, because I remember one of them, I think it was like a very random one. He was like talking about like it was passed down that you pray to the east.
Mm-hmm.
So like that was like a specific one.
Sure, yeah, I suppose that's not, yeah, sure, yep, that's a good one. It's not called out anywhere, I don't think. But yeah, properly speaking, our churches should all face east unless they're in a building that wasn't purpose-built to be a church. And then the goal is usually to, at some point, build one that faces east. But, yep.
So I often hear online,
Uh-oh.
I don't know how to refute this at all,
Okay.
that they talk about the Council of Nicaea and talk about how it corrupted the Bible to begin with. I don't know what to do with that. All I have is Ignatius of Antioch to point to. How would you refute that?
By a very brief look at the history. It is pretty obvious looking at it for not very long that if your argument is that some perfect book fell from heaven, when? How did that happen? Because you didn't get all of the epistles from St. Paul, right? He wrote to the Corinthians. They had the ones to the Corinthians and not anyone else. Or to the Ephesians or to whoever else, right? And each of the Gospels were written in a similar way for a people. And it wasn't until much later that they realized, like, hey, wait, other people probably want these too. Maybe we should collect all of these things. I guess I'm not totally certain in what way they mean corrupting, as if, do you mean like changing the text?
The indoctrination of Christ being actually God, they claim that nobody worshipped him ahead of time of that as God himself. But
God,
like I said,
Jesus says he's God.
Yeah.
So
that's where their claim says it's been corrupted by the Council of Nicaea.
So the claim is that the text was changed.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, the earliest manuscripts we have predate that. So, again, reading the early manuscripts would be a very surefire way to knock that out.
How can we put it into books instead of keeping it in scrolls?
Because it's easier.
Okay. Makes sense.
I don't want to deal with a scroll, do you? I mean, it doesn't change anything about the text, right? It's just a different format. You can have it in a PDF too, and it's not wildly different now that it's a PDF, right? Yeah.
Oh, let's say too, like one of the ones I found was like interesting too for like reading like the apostolic writings, like the earliest ones, so not the apostles themselves, but the earliest ones. That it's actually interesting because I think it's First Clement of Rome, like almost, I think it's like the first instance like directly quotes the Gospel of Matthew. So I guess that could be like a reputation to like that it's corrupted, because I noticed that there's a lot of those early writings that actually, before there was actually a canon of it, that a lot of them were directly quoting stuff from scripture that it wasn't written down, canonized yet. So like, I guess that could also prove that, yeah, like it wasn't changed over time, that even before there was a Bible, like somehow they all.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that, I mean, we have early manuscripts, and,
Yeah.
and not complete necessarily, but so it's pretty easy to just go check. Beyond that, yeah, there's plenty of people, early writers that you can find quoting one form or another. It would be an immense amount of work to A, change the text, B, change all of the references to it everywhere, and B, erase all evidence prior to it ever having been a different way. If that were the case, it would seem obvious to me that you would somewhere find a different text that says something else, and yet we do not have that. And even in times where things were burned, like the writings of Origen, we still have some of them, right? They were not able to utterly destroy everything he did, because that's really hard to do. So if there were going to be some massive conspiracy like that, we would have found something by now that would have said otherwise, somewhere. And we haven't. So I would argue that the burden lies on those proving that it was changed to prove that it was changed, rather than for us to prove the negative, which you can't really do.
Is the Old Testament exactly the Torah, or is it a little?
Short answer, yes. We have there's no modification to the Old Testament of any kind. Yeah.
And do you know if like the early Jews, like from the Old Testament, did they have like the Torah, the whole, or did they just have certain like?
They did not have a bound copy with all of the texts together, but they in one form or another had all of the texts. That was part of what Jesus actually talks about a little bit, which was that some of the groups rejected the prophets. So some of the groups of Jews would not have had all of them, but as a whole, Judaism had all of the texts of the Old Testament. Certain groups rejected some of them, but they had all of them.
What about, when you said, too, like, so the Turks took over Constantinople, like, what type of, did any, like, try to, like, reform the patriarch's role over there, that we see, like, they did try to change some stuff, but otherwise, like, they may have remained same?
So you're talking about purely, like, ecclesiastical authority?
Or, like, just, did anything actually change after that part got taken over? Because I know, like, it was still, like, in, like, up north, but then, like, anything, like, in the actual...
Yeah, so I mean, the Slavic lands were Orthodox by that time, and that never changed. Yes, there was a change in the ecclesiastical authority of the hierarchs there. Many of what had been similar to how I described Metropolitan Tikhon being here in America, that were now under a new authority, a singular empire of the Turks, found themselves in some form or another subjected to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Even if it wasn't technically that way, it was often kind of forced to be that way. For example, the confirmation of their election may have to be approved by the ecumenical patriarch, even though that doesn't actually make it any sense. But the Turks found it much easier to deal with one singular person than all of these people, so you get to be the one, and if you don't like it, then you can die. And we'll put someone in that does. So they didn't really mess with anything in terms of the faith itself, because they just didn't care enough to do that. It wasn't worth their while. But again, from an authority standpoint, it was much easier for them to kind of condense it a little bit. So that's why today you still see that there are Greeks on a lot of these ethnic thrones that don't make sense to have a Greek on them. But at one point in time, they were under the Turkish Empire, and that's sort of ethos, shall we say, has continued to today, even though it doesn't actually make a lot of sense.
What about, like, that, too? Like, you said earlier, there is kind of like a split between Russia, like a Russian jurisdiction, and the Russian Orthodoxy. Like, so what's kind of going on with that, and how does that affect, like, Orthodoxy in America?
Do you all understand the concept of a federated service like Blue Sky or Lemmy or trying to think of other options? I mean, technically blockchain too, but that's a weird technical example. Well, that makes it a little more difficult. Federated. Think of the states in North America, right? They all kind of get to do their own thing, and then we've got a federal government over top that sort of tries to tell them to do stuff, and sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it doesn't. That's a terrible example, but I guess we'll go with it because that's what I'm on now. If each state was sort of the end-all be-all, which was more like what we had prior to the United States, with the Federalist Papers. You basically have like little nations that are just sort of strapped together because they've all agreed to be together.
Or the
And if-
Article of Confederation. so
Yeah,
we did that
yeah.
one.
If one of them leaves, okay, well, they're over there doing their thing, and everyone else is over here doing our thing. Doesn't really change anything. If they decide to come back, great. We'll strap ourselves back together again. If not, okay. The problem with the Catholic Church was that they started like changing core tenets of the faith to be different things, and that's when we started to have major problems with the concept of them coming back, because they no longer believed the same thing we did. If they believed the same thing we did, then it would be very easy for us to come back together, but they don't. So we can't just kind of bolt them back onto us.
Yeah. Oh, I mean like for Russia though. Like, did you
I
say-
know, but I mean that
Oh,
more
yeah,
extreme
it's
example of
Yeah.
the other time we've had a big split like that. Yeah, for Russia right now, it really makes no difference at all most of the time. Their faith is no different than anyone else. They teach the same thing they've always have. Their hierarchs are still considered to be valid hierarchs. They're just being angry over there. And someday they'll hopefully come to their senses and it'll be fine.
But that's kind of like, you said, like kind of creating a little bit of a rift with the rest of like the Orthodox diocese, or?
Yeah, but even there it's a little weird because some groups have followed suit and are not in communion with one or the other, and others like the OCA are in communion with both. So we don't, there is a little bit of a rift there are some tensions, definitely. But at the end of the day, their orthodoxy is not in question, at least at this point in time.
Because I think I've seen one where it was the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, like a few years back, there's certain things that the Patriarch in Moscow or the Russian Patriarch was doing. So I don't know if it was like, what like those type of rifts or like potential schism or like coming about. I forgot exactly what.
So the thing to remember is that these schisms happen all the time for us. Jerusalem and Antioch were in schism for almost a decade, about a decade ago. And then it healed, and it was fine. That was over the ordination of priests in jurisdiction that was questioned as to who was supposed to have it, which is not too dissimilar to the current situation. And eventually the cooler heads prevailed, and now they're all happy. So, yeah, I mean, could it become a major problem that eventually becomes something like the Catholic Church? Sure. At this point in time, that seems pretty unlikely, but could happen, I suppose. Yeah. But yeah, at this point in time, I don't think anyone's really considering much more than eventually they'll come to their senses and people will make up and it'll be fine. Even if that's unfortunate right now. Yeah.
You know Greek or Hebrew?
Nope. I can read a little bit of Greek, not enough to be useful. As in I can pronounce it. I don't know what I'm saying.
I was just asking my question anyway.
Sure.
How would you correlate the in John 8:58 the I am statement to the Exodus Moses in the burning bush, the I am who I am?
Yep, same thing. That's why he almost gets stoned for saying it. That is exactly the same thing. Yep. Oon in Greek, as you can see on Christ's halo up there. Well, anyone else? We've still got like 15
I have a
minutes.
very question about the Septuagint and the Masoretic text.
Sure, go for it.
So, as I understand it, the Masoretic text came pretty much in the medieval era?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And that is why Protestant Bible has Masoretic text?
Yes.
Because it was the most available to the reformers.
That's not the reason I heard.
Oh.
So just for context for everyone else. So the Masoretic text is the text that the Jews use currently and that most of the, if not all of the Protestant world uses. The Catholic world has sort of conformed the Septuagint to the Masoretic text in a kind of weird way. But we use the Septuagint. The Masoretic text is a text that, so earlier I said at the time of Christ, the Jews used the Septuagint almost exclusively. As Christianity began to grow and become larger, Christians started taking quotes from the Septuagint and using it to show that Christ is God, that he's the Messiah, or is the Christ. And the Jews didn't like that. And so they found some Masoretic, some Hebrew, they started reverting to the Hebrew text and saying, well, you're only saying that because that's what the Greek says, but the Greek is actually wrong, which they had never said prior to this point in time. And so their version reorganizes the Psalms, for example. It's the same number, but in a different order. So sometimes if you ever see our texts, we read Psalm 50 all the time. It's Psalm 51 in the Masoretic text, but it's Psalm 50 for us. Psalm 33 that we do at the end of liturgy is Psalm 34, I think, in the Masoretic text. There was a thought for a while amongst biblical scholars that there may be some credence to this idea because there were certain texts that we only had in Greek. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved that wrong by finding Hebrew versions of everything that we have, to my knowledge anyway, that we previously had only had Greek copies for. We now have very ancient Hebrew versions of as well, to show that actually the Septuagint wasn't crazy or weird. It was recording a valid tradition within the Jews at the time. So yes, when they edited their text to make it less Christian, taking the Hebrew versions of things when they had them, no longer using the word for virgin and just translating it as young woman, for example. These were all things that were done in an attempt to try and be as not Christian as they could. When the reformers were looking for something, they figured that, well, whatever the Catholic Church is doing must be wrong. So what are the Jews doing? They must be right. Not realizing that the Jews' version had actually been modified not that long ago to be very different from what it was at the time of Christ. And so they accepted that wholesale and started railing against the extra books of the Septuagint, which got at first just moved to the back and eventually cut altogether. So the Catholic Church went so far as to move them to the back. They did not go so far as to actually completely remove them, but
Is there a big difference between the two?
who all was here on Pascha? Was it you? Not you. Was everyone else here? So on Holy Saturday, well, I guess technically the day before, but Saturday morning, we did this whole big thing where we came around and we threw all the flower petals and everything. That was in the middle of a whole bunch of Old Testament readings, right? And two of those Old Testament readings, maybe you remember, extra brownie points if you do, the choir sort of took over as the reading was being done to say a refrain from the reading. One of those was the song of the three youths in the furnace. That does not exist at all in the Masoretic text. But it is not only very much a thing in the Septuagint, it is a very important part of our service. There's a few instances, I can never remember them off the top of my head, where Jesus actually quotes things from the Old Testament that are not in the Septuagint, or sorry, not in the Masoretic text, which I find somewhat humorous. But I wish I could. I need to just look it up and put it in my thing so I remember. But yeah.
And so Masoretic text was like came about in like 1400s or something, like it was
Something like that. Yeah, I mean,
really long time
it was at
after.
least 1,000 and change years later. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it was
okay.
a good
Crazy.
while later. Yep.
And the Septuagint is about 200 years before Christ?
Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
And like I said, because most of the Jews spoke Greek at the time, that was the text you found everywhere. People didn't speak Hebrew, so they had no use for Hebrew text. Most people spoke Greek.
I think like the other one I saw too for the Masoretic one is like you touched on like the prophecy language is basically like more like dribbled down so that like you said like so virgin is not anymore, it's like young woman. But I think the other one I saw too was the books that they specifically take out are very big to point even further to the prophecy of Christ.
Yeah.
So I think like that was like another big one. I think like the big one too, I think they change a lot in Isaiah
Mm-hmm.
because that's like a big one that he was like quotes
Yeah.
a lot from.
If you are familiar with the Orthodox Study Bible, which I think I've got the information in the thing. If not, we've got a bunch of them in the library, and I'm sure we sell some in the bookstore. Go find one somewhere. At the very beginning, it talks a little bit about the differences between the two. So it's worth taking a look at. I'm sure there's a good Wikipedia page on it too.
Yeah, like
Or a bad wiki.
yeah, I've seen like so far in it. Like,
Well, there's
certain
Orthodox
ones that talk
Wiki's
about
pretty
that. It'll like there's a lot of it will show like an abbreviation on it. So like a certain passage and say like, oh, like this doesn't appear in either. Like they think they call it like MT for I think Masoretic, and there's like another one they say like it's altered in this one too though. But it says like this is like the Septuagint version.
There are only a few translations of the Septuagint in English, and they tend to be sold as singular, just the Old Testament. So it's actually kind of hard to find if you wanted to like just have a copy of it by itself. But yeah,
You said you were talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. How come we don't have the Book of Enoch in our Bible? The Book of Enoch. How come we don't have that in the Bible? I heard it was also dug up with the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I'm not familiar. I'd have to go look. I can do that. Get back to you. I don't know everything that was dug up at the time.
Because I think the Ethiopian church has.
Yes, I think they do. Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, they do have the Book of Enoch.
Yeah, my guess is it wasn't popular or translated into Greek at the time, and yeah, there's something weird with the Ethiopian church where there's like a group of Jews that sort of meandered south and just got lost that ended up in Ethiopia, and so they have like, if I'm remembering right, they have a very ancient Jewish tradition there that does not match at all the Jewish tradition from Jerusalem, because it's probably, presumably equally valid. It's just a very different branch from what we think of. So it could be from that as well. But yeah, I'd have to check.
I think I saw one was described as like that it's included in it because it's more like what kind of you're describing like the other church writings or the other Christian writings where it's a story that's not canon but it's like it offers some either like moral lesson to it or something. That's one because I know it's like it's quoted also.
I don't think I've ever heard
one,
anyone. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that it's bad that you should
Yeah.
read it. It's just
Well, because
not including
it talks about like Enoch and like other like angelic orders and like other prophetic things.
Yeah, like the
I'd have to do some reading on it. I'm
Yeah.
not as familiar with that off the top of my head.
But that's just what I've always like seen like the explanation is like that's why it's included because didn't actually think that it was canon. It was just a story that everybody understood and can get a lesson from it.
I think it was common knowledge at that time. Like most people understood sort of the supernatural
Actually, I mean, was
hierarchies,
it you who asked the question of things that we have?
The traditions.
Yeah, traditions that aren't. Yeah, I mean, we have an understanding of ranks of angels that I don't think comes from anything.
Yeah, 'cause, like Enoch, I think there's like a bunch of like orders and ranks, and that's where I think I haven't seen like the Orthodox ranks on angels yet.
Yeah, I mean, you can find it. We'll have icons that show ranks. We often depict their state. I'm trying to see if we have any that are clear, but not that I'm seeing right now off the top of my head. But I mean, obviously, we show the cherubim often with their wings. We show the archangel in the Annunciation. We have a guardian angel icon that's not uncommon for kids, and then we'll depict the circular. Which one is that? I can't remember now, but anyway, thrones, right? It's thrones. Anyway, so yeah, we have a tradition of ranks of angels, very much. I'll try and get back to you.
Thank you.
Well, is that all? Pretty close to time. We have a few more minutes, but
Yeah, that's on my head at the moment.
all right. Well, you've got my contact information if anything does come up, and, well, actually, we won't be doing this next week, but the week after. Yeah, feel free to find me after services, email, text, whatever. If you want to set up a meeting at some point and have a longer chat, we can do that. So, I'm fairly available if you want to contact me.
Can I ask theology questions as well?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
I went to Sunday.
Can I pull it up real quick, cause I wrote it down in a note, cause
Okay,
I forget a lot.
that's fine.
Okay, real quick then for next week, so the parish feast, is it, so I know you said, I think 6 is the feast, but what time is you said the liturgy is before they do the liturgy and then the feast, so do you know what time to do the liturgy?
I would have to check there. Oh, it's 6.
Like, oh, it's like 6, and then after the liturgy, then they do the feast.
Then they do the meal, yeah.
Okay.
This is in Castro Valley?
Mhm.
Okay.
Their bishop will be there, so it'll be an
Uh-huh.
interesting experience if you haven't seen that yet.
What's like the quorum for addressing him then?
That is somewhat up to you. It is pretty standardized how you refer to a priest. There are so many different ways to refer to a bishop. Bishop, just what they are is often fine. So you just heard me say Metropolitan Deacon a few times. You've heard us say in services Archbishop Benjamin all the time. When we have a new bishop elected here in a few months, we will call him Bishop whomever. That's fine. Totally fine to just say the rank. There are all manner of ethnic diminutive forms to refer to bishops, which we'll talk about a little later. For some reason, basically none of them are translated to English. So you'll hear Vladika, which is the Slavic one. You'll hear Sayedna, which is the Arabic one. The Greeks kind of don't do that as much, but theoretically it would be some form of Vespota. Technically, when we do those types of translations, liturgically, we just say master. So you will hear people sometimes say master bless. Yeah, if you're more comfortable just saying the rank and not worrying about any of that, totally fine.
How does one become a bishop?
You get elected. You get elected by the diocese and ordained by multiple bishops. So, yeah, that will all be, it'll be in the cathedral in San Francisco when we do that in August, so go to it. It'll be
Oh,
quite the experience, I'm sure.
So I wrote down this question. So I said, you know how Paul writes how he can't wait for death so he can be separated from his flesh? I understood that as his desires or like fleshly desires.
Okay?
Because he also wrote the good that I want to do, I don't do. The evil that I don't want to do, I do.
Mm-hmm.
If we're separated from flesh and don't desire fleshly desires, like for example lust, how is it that angels in heaven still lust like Lucifer if they
Angels in heaven do not.
so
The angel you just described is not in heaven, is he?
No, he was originally in heaven and got a desire that was in him, right? Or a pride.
This is a whole branch of theology that you are opening right now, but the very brief way to say that is that the angels had their time to make their decision, and that time has passed. Our time passes when we die, right? After that point, we don't have any opportunity to work out our own salvation. And we will become like the angels, set in whatever we have done. We're not done, I suppose. So that's the very, very brief answer to that.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I will see you all. I'm just gone next Tuesday evening, so I'll be here for all the weekends and everything. I'll be here for the weekday services. If you are able to come to them and want to, please come. They're all open to the public, so you see them all on the calendar. I try to mark when they're canceled if something comes up, but feel free to come to any of them. Otherwise, I will see you around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.